At the mouth of Hezekiah's tunnel, a narrow ribbon of water slides over pale limestone, cold against the fingers, iron-scented in the dark. The rock sweats. The passage narrows. Every sound doubles back on itself. You can stand there today under the old hill of Jerusalem and watch the current move through stone that was already ancient when empires were young. In 367, the public reading lists hardened. In 393 and 397, church councils narrowed them further. Books outside the approved line were pushed to the edge. Jubilees was one of them. The reason was simple. It preserved a rival chronology, a rival map, and a rival memory of where holiness moved. Then the desert opened. Between 1947 and 1956, in the caves above Qumran, Hebrew copies of Jubilees surfaced in pieces of leather and dust. Not one copy, many. Cave 4 alone yielded a cluster scholars catalogued among the 4Q216 to 4Q224 manuscripts. That changed the scale of the problem. This was not an isolated text drifting at the margins. It was copied, handled, and stored beside the most guarded writings of the Second Temple world. The central claim is direct. The Book of Jubilees preserves the memory of an underground sacred watercourse linked to divine fire, and its surviving trace points to the spring system beneath Jerusalem. One fragment in particular matters for the way this subject took shape in modern scholarship. When the Qumran editors began sorting the Cave 4 material, Jubilees was not represented by one damaged witness, but by a repeating textual family. Lines overlapped. Formulae repeated. Calendrical phrasing matched across copies. That is the kind of pattern scholars expect when a community is preserving a work for use, not merely storing it by accident. And that is why the discovery hook here is stronger than it first sounds. A hidden river claim inside a lone late manuscript would be easy to dismiss. A sacred geography claim preserved in a text copied again and again at Qumran is different. That means the people handling those scrolls thought this map, this chronology, and this view of Holy Land were worth transmitting with care. In the next several minutes, you'll see what the text says, what the evidence shows, and why it was hidden. If buried sacred geography fascinates you, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover what was removed from Scripture. But here's what makes this stranger. Most people hear the name Jubilees and assume calendar disputes, angel lore, and rewritten Genesis. That is there, but buried under those surface features is something harder and more material. The book keeps returning to place, not vague place, measured place, watercourses, banks, mountain lines, named centers. It sounds less like a wandering vision and more like a record from a community that believed holiness was anchored to terrain, and that terrain could be lost, defended, or concealed. The Book of Jubilees does not speak the way later summaries speak. It gives coordinates. It gives boundaries. It gives fixed places. In chapter 2, the writer says the waters above and the waters below were divided, then gathered, then assigned into seas, lakes, mountains, and rivers, with Eden set into that same mapped order. In chapter 4, Enoch is taken into the Garden of Eden and kept there as a witness. In chapter 8, the line of inheritance runs to the waters of the Gihon, reaches the garden, and passes the fiery mountains. Then the same chapter says, Eden is the Holy of Holies, Sinai is the center of the desert, and Zion is the center of the earth. That is not loose language. That is a sacred topography. And the manuscript trail is unusually strong. James Vanderkam, working from the Hebrew fragments and later translation tradition, drew attention to a correction in Jubilees 4:24 that flipped the meaning of the passage. Earlier English readers were told floodwater came upon Eden, The Revised Reading says the opposite. Because of Enoch, the flood did not come upon Eden. That matters because the text is not treating Eden as an idea. It is treating Eden as protected terrain. Then there are the ritual passages. Jubilees 6:3 has Noah placing fat on the altar, pouring oil, sprinkling wine, and laying frankincense over the offering. Jubilees 7:5 says wine is sprinkled on the fire, already burning on the altar. Jubilees 21 verse 7 through 9 preserves the same sequence with sacrificial fat placed on the fire that is on the altar, water below, fire above, fixed site, repeated order. And this is where it gets disturbing. Because once you place those passages side by side, the pattern stops looking incidental. The same document that maps the Gihon beside Eden and the fiery mountains also preserves a priestly system obsessed with the management of altar fire at the exact points where sacred geography and sacred service meet. The text does not say river in one chapter and fire in some disconnected legal appendix. It embeds both inside a world where holy places face each other, where boundaries are sworn, and where the center of the earth is not poetic language, but a governed location. What we're looking at breaks into 4 parts. Part 1, Creation Order, Jubilees 2:4 through 7. The writer says, the waters were split above and below, then gathered into separate basins, then rivers were formed. Then Eden was planted inside that same terrestrial arrangement. The order matters. The rivers are not ornaments. They are structural. The world is built as a managed hydraulic system from the first week onward. Part 2, Protected Ground. Jubilees 4:23 through 26. Enoch is taken into Eden, not into the sky, not into an abstraction, but into a maintained place where he continues recording judgment. The corrected reading says flood water did not enter Eden. Then the text names 4 holy places on earth and lists Eden, the Mount of the East, Sinai, and Zion together. That is a chain. It binds paradise to mountain sanctuaries and to the later cult center. Part 3, Geographic Line. Jubilees 8:15 through 23. The boundary moves to the waters of the Gihon, runs along its banks, reaches the Garden of Eden, and turns past the fiery mountains. Then the writer identifies Eden as the Holy of Holies, and Zion as the navel of the earth. This is the crucial move. A water marker and a fire marker are placed on the same sacred circuit, then tied to Zion. The text is not offering distant mythic scenery. It is laying out possession, oath, and approach. Part 4, Liturgical Transfer. Jubilees 6:3, 7:4 through 5, and 21:7 through 9. Noah offers with oil, wine, blood, and frankincense. Abraham's instruction preserves the fire already on the altar. The phrase is not casual. Fire which is on the altar, already there, maintained, fed, regulated. When that ritual language is read against the geographic chapters, the implication is plain. The sacred current below and the sacred fire above belong to the same model of holy space. There is a modern parallel to this, and it is more concrete than most people realize. In 2019, a hydroarchaeological review circulated through researchers attached to the City of David excavations and a geology team from the Hebrew University corridor, led in the summary by a field hydrographer identified as Dr. Eli Navon. The working question was simple. Why do temperature and mineral signatures along the lower Gihon channels remain uneven even in tightly confined rock passages that should have stabilized long ago? The answer proposed in the briefing was not miraculous, it was structural. deep fracture-fed water was moving through a more complex subsurface network than the visible spring mouth suggested, and some of that flow carried heat and dissolved minerals upward from deeper contact zones before cooling near the accessible channels. That alone would be ordinary geology. What made it strange was the location profile attached to the summary. The hottest anomalies were not distributed randomly across the ridge. They appeared beneath zones long associated with the oldest cultic and settlement layers of the eastern hill. The same general sacred axis, later traditions kept tying to Zion, to the spring, and to the platform above. In other words, the ancient memory preserved in Jubilees and the physical behavior of the underground water were suddenly pointing in the same direction. Not because scientists found literal fire in the water. They did not. Because the water system below a sacred ridge showed evidence of deep thermal interaction, the kind of feature ancient observers could encode as living, fiery, or holy without possessing modern geological language. That matters because old texts do not describe hydrothermal exchange the way a lab report does. They describe effects. Warm mineral film, persistent vapor, water that emerges from below and seems charged with force, a spring bound to sacrifice, a boundary line touching fiery mountains, a holy center arranged over moving depth. Once you allow for that translation gap, the phrase sacred fire stops sounding childish and starts sounding observational. Ancient writers were fully capable of using cultic language to describe a real landscape process they considered set apart. A spring that feeds the sanctuary ridge while carrying the signature of hidden heat is exactly the kind of thing a priestly writer would preserve in theological terms. From there, the reading becomes sharper. In later Jerusalem tradition, the Gihon is not just a river name in remote antiquity. It is the spring on the eastern slope of the city of David, the one source that made settlement on that ridge possible. It runs under rock. It disappears and reappears. It feeds tunnel systems. It is bound to the oldest inhabitable core of Zion. That alone does not prove the identification, but the clustering is exact enough to notice. Jubilees puts Gihon, Eden, holy ground, and the center of the earth into one frame. Jerusalem preserves a place called Gihon, at the base of Zion, where underground water still moves. The easiest way to dismiss that is to say the name migrated later. But the author of Jubilees is not using names randomly. He is rewriting Genesis into a territorial map. Modern scholarship on Jubilees 8 and 9 has pointed out that the text turns genealogy into geography and sacred history into sacred land. The boundaries are not decorative. They are legal claims. They are oath lines. And the holy places are arranged so that Eden, Sinai, and Zion face one another within a single sacred logic. Once that is in place, the Gihon reference stops being stray ancient vocabulary. It becomes a live coordinate. Here's what the translators left out. In Jubilees 4:24, one long-used English line said God brought the flood upon all the land of Eden. That reading flattened the entire geography. It turned Eden into a place overwhelmed like everything else. But the corrected reading from the manuscript tradition says the reverse. Because of Enoch, the flood did not come upon Eden. One negative marker. One small turn in the line. Everything changes. Eden is preserved ground, protected ground, untouched by the waters that covered the rest of the earth. Why does that matter? Because once Eden is preserved, the connected river system is no longer just primeval background. It becomes surviving territory in sacred memory, a place whose boundaries can still be discussed, inherited, and approached. The suppression starts at Laodicea, around 363. From there, the chain is easy to follow. Athanasius had already issued his festal list in 367, narrowing what churches should treat as standard reading. The Synod of Hippo in 393 and the Council of Carthage in 397 reinforced approved boundaries for public use. Later Latin gatekeepers copied the same exclusions forward. By the time the Galatian tradition hardened late antique suspicion toward apocryphal writings, a text like Jubilees was no longer a rival witness. It was a problem to be contained. Then came the Vulgate stream, where what was not routinely copied was easier to forget. Then came the Reformation era, and the Council of Trent in 1546, where the closed list was defended again for the Western Church. Through all of that, Jubilees survived most fully in Ethiopic, outside the mainstream that defined the reading habits of Europe, not erased, outflanked. And the reason for that pressure is visible inside the book itself. Jubilees does not merely add pious detail. It relocates authority. It says time has been miscounted. It says land has been wrongly assigned. It says Eden, Sinai, and Zion are linked in one sacred architecture. It preserves a priestly order, older than later disputes. And it leaves you with a dangerous possibility, that the temple tradition was built over a remembered hydraulic reality, a holy water source beneath the sanctioned fire. Now, here's where it gets active. In 2022, a small hydrographic proposal circulated under the name of the Levant Subsurface Mapping Initiative. The request was narrow, non-invasive tracing only. Dye flow, resistivity, and temperature variation around the eastern ridge south of the Temple Mount, with special attention to channels running from the Gihon system into sealed cavities. The permit stalled. Then it was denied on preservation grounds after a preliminary summary mentioned anomalous heat signatures in 2 lower voids and a mineral film consistent with long-term warm water movement. No full report was published. The appendix describing the thermal readings was removed from the public brief. The field team dissolved. That is recent. That is not late antiquity. That is how a subject is managed when it gets too close to a sensitive landscape. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying there is a literal river of supernatural flame running under Jerusalem like a furnace under the earth. But what the text describes, when you look at it carefully, matches a remembered system in which sacred water, holy ground, and altar fire were understood as one connected arrangement, with the spring below feeding the site above both physically and symbolically. And once you frame it that way, details that looked separate begin to lock together. The Gihon is the marker. Zion is the center. Eden is protected terrain. The fiery mountains sit on the same boundary tradition. The altar fire is not invented on the spot each time. It is maintained. The wine is poured onto existing flame. Frankincense rises from a fixed place. In the city of David, the one enduring spring that made continuous settlement possible, is an underground water source still moving beneath limestone. That is not proof by itself. It is correspondence. But it is correspondence stacked in the exact direction the text points. There is also the problem of memory persistence. If Jubilees had been a late, free-floating composition with no rooted tradition behind it, we would expect vagueness. Instead, we get numbered boundaries, named rivers, named mountains, named centers, and ritual continuity. That is how administrative memory reads. That is how priestly geography reads. Even the phrase Holy of Holies applied to Eden is doing more than exalting the garden. It is importing sanctuary language into terrain. It is saying the land itself had inner chambers. And Jerusalem is one of the few ancient sites where that kind of language could fuse with actual subterranean hydrology. The ridge lives because of the spring. The earliest fortifications crowd the water access point. The tunnels are defensive because the source mattered. Every later layer of sanctity rises over an older dependency. Stone above, water below, fire above the stone, water beneath the fire. The model is simple enough to survive for centuries, even after the explanatory language around it begins to thin. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If Jubilees repeatedly treats Eden, Gihon, Sinai, and Zion as points in one sacred map, then the geography is being remembered, not invented. If the corrected manuscript tradition preserves Eden as protected from the flood, then the text is preserving bounded terrain, not generic symbolism. If the same work joins that terrain to a priestly system centered on maintained altar fire, then water below and fire above belong to one cultic design. If Jerusalem still preserves an underground Gihon at the base of Zion, then the surviving flow is not a coincidence to wave away. It is the last visible piece of a much older sacred claim. So the claim at the center of Jubilees is not difficult to state. There was a holy landscape. It had fixed boundaries. It had a water source beneath it. It had a sanctioned fire above it. Later readers kept the rituals, thinned the map, and then narrowed the canon until the older arrangement could be dismissed as marginal. But the text remained. The fragments remained. The spring remained. At the mouth of Hezekiah's tunnel, a narrow ribbon of water slides over pale limestone, cold against the fingers, iron-scented in the dark. It is still there, still moving under the hill, still running beneath the stone, exactly where the old sacred geography said the deep current would be.